So I just want to take a few minutes here to recap our introduction to figured bass, or really what we're talking about is interval symbols below a chord or below sometimes just the lowest note of a chord, showing us which intervals to fill in above that note, above the lowest sounding note or above the bass. Okay, so we're going to review that for triads and for seventh chords, just so you can kind of get used to the standard notation. It's pretty standardized with those things. So we'll start with the triad first. I'll just use a good old C major triad. I'll start with it in root position, and then I'll talk about it again in first inversion. Remember, first inversion is what I call the first way of messing with, or the first way of changing what the lowest note is going to be, right? So typical, of course, is root position, but the first way I can mess with it going up is with the third in the bass, and then the second way I can mess with it, or what I'll call the second inversion, is putting the fifth in the bass, okay? So there's that chord in root position. Here it is in first inversion, okay? Notice now that the E, or the third of the chordal third, is in the bass. It's the lowest sounding note. That's what makes it a first inversion. And to make it a second inversion, I will put the fifth of the chord, or the chordal fifth, in the bass, okay? So we'll just go through, just like we did in class last week, and figure out the generic intervals above the lowest sounding note, whichever note that may happen to be. So in a first inversion, the lowest sounding note is here. I go from C up to G, that gives me a fifth. And then if I go from C to E, that gives me a third, right? So, and this is actually the case with all root position triads. They're always going to be, it's always going to distill down to a fifth above the bass and a third above the bass. If we go to the first inversion here, now we have the E in the bass, okay? Above the E is a sixth, and then the next one in line here is a third. So the full symbol for first inversion for figured bass in a triad is a 6-3. And then we'll go to second inversion. Now G, or the chordal fifth, is in the bass, but above that G, above that fifth, this interval is a sixth, and the one below that, this interval here is a fourth. Okay, so a 6-4 is what we would really call that. Also is another way of talking about a second inversion triad, or an inversion of the triad where the fifth is in the bass. Okay, so these are the standard figured bass notations in terms of the long form, but I do want to talk about them again in terms of the shorthand for these, right? Which really just applies, I guess, to the root position and the first inversion. In root position, if we figured out that this is a root position triad here, then actually the figured bass notation on this first one for the shorthand would be blank. There's nothing there, right? And that's just a way of telling us that the lowest note is going to form the root of a root position triad, so there's no need to actually put the symbol there, okay? For a first inversion, we will just use the 6, and the 3 is assumed, right? So that's the shorthand for first inversion triad. It's just a 6. For second inversion, we go ahead and use the full symbol, because we want to highlight the fact that even though there's a 6th above the bass, there's also this 4th above the bass, and you don't want to confuse it with the 6th above the bass that has a 3, because that's a different inversion. Okay, so here's what that actually kind of looks like in a more practical setting. Let's say, for example, that you have a set of notes here, right? I'll do this, draw that a little bit more precisely. And what I don't want to do as the composer is I don't want to actually write out everything that, in this case, maybe a keyboard player might need to play. But I do want to let them know, I do want to give them a clear indication of what harmonies should be formed. So the keyboard player isn't just going to play the notes here in the bass line. They're going to use the right hand and play some fill-in notes as well to complete the chords. So rather than write in those fill-in notes for them, what I'll do is I'll just give them figured bass notation. And so what that means is, what I've done here at least, is I've said on this first chord, go ahead and fill in whatever notes you need to make this the root of a triad. And then on the second chord, I've said, okay, fill in some notes to make this a second inversion of the triad. In other words, treat this low note as the fifth of the chord. And then for this one here, I've said, okay, great. Let's make up another triad where this note here is the chordal third, and make this the first inversion triad. I just want you to notice how I've kind of swapped places here. Okay. So we put the second inversion actually here, and the first inversion here. Okay, so in any event, I wanted to do this pattern because it's a fairly common pattern, one that we will actually be talking about in the coming days. So if I were to flesh this out as the keyboard player, then I would need to put in some more notes, obviously, for the root position triad. I would need to throw in some E's and G's someplace. I probably wouldn't do it in close position like this, but I'm just, for the sake of brevity, just showing you them just all close together here. And that would complete this figure for the first chord. That one's done. For this one, this is a 6/4, which I know from my study of theory means a second inversion triad, where this note is the chordal fifth, right? So I know if I want to get that, I need to have a sixth above the bass and a fourth above the bass. So actually this turns out to be a G major chord, right, in second inversion. And then, oops, there we go. I'll put the notes back here. Good. And now for this one, the third one here, I need to have a sixth above the bass, but remember that sixth is just a shorthand. It stands for the full symbol, which is 6/3. So in order to fill that out, I'm going to need both a sixth above the bass and a third above the bass, right? Which gives me now that first inversion triad. So that's a quick review of figured bass symbols as used in triads. Remember, for the shorthand for that, a root position triad will have no symbol, right? It'll just be blank. A first inversion triad is represented by the figure 6, and a second inversion triad is represented by 6/4. Okay, so that's triads. And then seventh chords. If we stick with the key of C major, I'll use my original root position triad, but then I'll pop a seventh up there as well. Okay. In terms of the figured bass notation, actually, no, I'll get to that later. Let's go ahead and talk about the intervals above the bass. Now the highest interval above the bass is a 7. Next in line is a 5th. And next in line is a 3rd. Okay, so the full figured bass symbol for a root position 7th chord is a 7/5/3. Of course, now that we know about this idea of abbreviations, we also know that we'll just call it a 7. Done. Okay, so that's root position 7th chord. For first inversion, that means I'm going to put the 3rd in the bass. Okay, we can figure this out again. Now the highest note is only a 6th above, but then this one here is a 5th above, and this one here is a 3rd above. Okay, so that's the full notation for the first inversion. The shorthand for that is just 6/5, and we'll assume that the 3rd is in place. Okay, and then for the second inversion, now I'll put the 5th in the bass. Just for fun, I'll put the 5th down here. Highest note above the low note here is a 6th here, and then we still have a 4. Notice how it looks a lot like the second inversion of the triad, right? Because it's the same collection of notes. I just added the chordal 7th, which in this case happens to be a 3rd above the bass. Okay, so there's my second inversion 7th chord. But remember, like with the other ones, we have a shorthand for this. I'm sure I'm slanting these all wrong, but that's okay. Okay, so for a second position 7th chord, the shorthand symbol is just plain old 4/3, and the 6th is assumed. Okay, and then because we have 4 different notes in the chord, we have the root position, but then 3 additional ways of messing with it, right? So that's what gives us now the 3rd inversion, with now the chordal 7th in the bass. Okay, and so now when I look above the lowest note, I have a 6th. Actually, let me keep it in red just for consistency. Above the lowest note, we have a 6th. and then we have a fourth, and then we have just a second, right? So it's a 6-4-2 in its full notation for this third inversion, but we're going to abbreviate that. Two ways we can abbreviate it. We can either call it a 4-2, or for an even more brief way of representing it, just a 2. So in the 4-2 version, the sixth is assumed, and if you call it a 2, then both the sixth and the fourth are assumed. Okay, so that's our figure-based notation for triads and seventh chords. I really recommend that you that you take some time to sort of commit these to memory. The triads, remember both ways of messing with it. Here we go. Involve a sixth up top. Okay, but in the first inversion, the middle interval is going to be a third. In the second inversion, the middle interval is going to be a fourth, right? And then, of course, the shorthand that goes along with those, okay, which I guess only applies to the first inversion. Okay. And then for the seventh chords, for me, the seventh chords are actually easier to remember if I just look at the shorthand. For root position, rather, my shorthand is a 7. And then for first inversion, my shorthand is a 6-5. Second inversion, it's 4-3. And for third inversion, I personally tend to just use 2. Now, why is that so handy? Because, well, first inversion is a 7. I'm sorry, root position, rather, is a 7. First inversion is 6-5, right? Second inversion is 4-3, seeing the pattern here. And then third inversion is 2. And they go perfectly in order, and all I'm doing is I'm just ascending notes from the 7. So that is the standard figured bass symbols for triads and seventh chords. We do sometimes apply chromatic alterations to these, and by chromatic alterations I mean we have some other symbols we use that raise or lower the triad, or sorry, raise or lower one or more members of the chord, but we will save that for another discussion. These are just the basic symbols for triads and seventh chords. I hope this is helpful. Thanks.